This episode of the Restoration Today podcast is brought to you by First Onsite. It seems like every business is looking to hire right now, but what are you looking for? First Onsite is searching for new team members that want to help others while building an authentically fulfilling career for themselves. Interested? Learn more at firstonsite.com/careers and find out how you can make a difference. First Onsite, together, we rise. Hello there. Thanks for checking out this episode of the Restoration Today podcast. Today, I'm excited to bring someone back onto the podcast who you met just within the last maybe like 6 weeks, couple months ago. It is Dr. Phil Klotzbach, who is from the Colorado State University Department of Atmospheric Science. I feel like that's a lot of words to string together. So I am talking to him on Thursday, June 1st. That's when we're recording this. And Phil is part of the team that releases the hurricane forecasts and predictions. He's a research scientist on that team. So I'm excited to talk about the latest predictions and what you guys just released today with you increased your forecast. And now you're saying that there's going to be more hurricanes even than you thought last time around and all of that. So I'm going to toss it over to you. Share a little bit about your background for people who maybe didn't meet you on the last podcast.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Phil Klotzbach. I'm a research scientist meteorologist in the Atmospheric Science Department at Colorado State University. I've been working there. I've been there for 21 years. I got my master's and PhD at CSU, and I had the great privilege to work under Dr. Bill Gray, who founded the Atlantic Seasonal Hurricane Forecast back in the early 1980s, and also made just tremendous amounts of contributions, and pretty much if there's anything related to hurricanes, he had his hands in it. He was very prolific scientist, and he also mentored a bunch of students. So I was his final PhD student. So he and I worked very closely on the seasonal forecasts for about 15 years. And I've been lead author on these forecasts all the way back to 2006, over 15 years as lead author on these forecasts. And so this is actually the 39th year that our group at CSU has been doing Atlantic Basin seasonal hurricane forecasts.
Wow. Okay. 39 years. Okay. So walk through what this latest forecast that was just released today is predicting for this season.
Yeah, so we're forecasting an above normal Atlantic hurricane season. We're forecasting a total of 20 named storms. So those are systems named by the National Hurricane Center, winds of 39 miles per hour or greater. Of those 20, 10 becoming hurricanes. And of those 10, 5 becoming major category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. Major hurricanes are hurricanes with winds 100 miles per hour or greater. And while they only make up about a quarter of all the storms that form in a particular year, on average, they do about 80 to 85% of the damage from storms. So those are often the storms that end up causing the most damage, being most destructive. And for example, last year, the U.S. had about $80 billion in damage from hurricanes last year, and about $75 billion was from Hurricane Ida, which was a Category 4 hurricane, hit Louisiana, and then brought massive flooding to the Mid-Atlantic states several days later.
Okay, so what are some of the differences or changes you were seeing in the Atlantic from the last forecast, which was what it brought? Was it in April that the last one was until now? What triggered some of the changes?
Yeah, that's right. So in April, we forecast 19 named storms, 9 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes. So basically, we increased all the numbers by 1. And a couple of big factors. One of the big factors is in April, we thought El Nino was unlikely. And now we think it's very unlikely that we're going to have El Nino this summer and fall. El Nino is warmer than normal waters in the central and eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. When El Nino occurs, it tends to increase winds, say 20, 30,000 feet in the atmosphere in the Atlantic, that tears apart hurricanes as they're trying to develop and to intensify. We think the odds of an El Nino this summer and fall are quite low. So consequently, the odds of basically having winds that are too strong for hurricanes to develop seems fairly low. So likely the winds will be more conducive for hurricane formation and intensification. When we did the initial outlook in early April, the tropical Atlantic water temperatures were near average, maybe even a little bit cooler than average, and they've warmed relative to normal. So obviously every year the North Atlantic warms up from winter to summer, but this year it's been warming up faster than normal. Now most of the tropical Atlantic is warmer than normal, and since a warmer than normal Atlantic basically provides more fuel for storms. Unfortunately, we think that the tropical Atlantic is likely to be warmer than normal this summer and fall, likely again leading to a pretty active hurricane season overall.
So this year you're predicting it to be even more active than last year, is that right?
That's correct. So last year we had a total of 21 storms, which would be more than the 20 that we predict, but of those 21, 7 became hurricanes. This year we're predicting 10. So it'll be busier than last year, but not quite up to the craziness that was the 2020 hurricane season, where we had a whopping 30 named storms, still seems hard to believe that we could actually have 30 named storms, and 14 hurricanes. So busier than last year, but not quite up to the levels that we saw in 2020.
Okay, so I know the last time you spoke about how things kind of ebb and flow. So we go through these periods where it's more active and then we go into more calm periods. So can you talk about that again for people who maybe have listened in and want to understand why do we have these years where we're really active, but then we go through a lull?
Yeah, so the Atlantic has generally been very big above. We've had 6 above normal seasons in a row. So if it seemingly has been busy, it's because it has. 2016 to 2021 were all above normal seasons. Obviously, a prediction of an above normal season is not guarantee an above normal season, but if our forecast is correct, this would be the 7th above normal season in a row. So if you think it's been busy, it has been busy. One of the big reasons why that's been the case the last few years is that we've generally had an environment that's been more like El Nino, we haven't had a significant El Nino since 2015. 2018 to 2019, we had a brief flirtation with El Nino. We briefly reached a threshold, but it was a pretty weak event. So that's one of the reasons why overall the Atlantic has been busy. Another reason is that the tropical Atlantic, the last, say, 25 to 30 years, has been warmer. And so while we have like the long-term warming that's climate change related, we also have periods where the Atlantic will be warmer than normal and colder than normal, even relative to kind of what the global temperatures are doing. In the last 25 to 30 years, the Atlantic has generally been warmer than normal. There's probably a couple of factors going into that. One is there's ocean circulation changes that occur in about 30 to 40 year time periods. That is one of the reasons. Another may be in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. There were a lot of basically aerosols, a lot of pollution, and that once that got cleaned up, basically the aerosols reflect. So if you have a lot of pollution, a lot of the aerosols basically reflect the radiation from the sun back out to space, and it causes things to be a little bit cooler. Since the Clean Air Act and some of that, basically cleaning up some of those aerosols has likely also helped contribute to the warming that's been observed in the Atlantic since the middle 90s. So that's another reason why we think we've been in a busier period for, say, the last 25 to 30 years.
Okay. Do you see more areas that are more prone in 2022 compared to other areas? Like, is the Gulf more prone than the East Coast or anything like that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I would love to be able to give you that information. Unfortunately, that's really, really hard. And so a couple of reasons why. One is hurricanes are steered pretty much by mid-latitude weather systems, and those just really aren't predictable on monthly or seasonal timescales. Another factor is, and I think it's something we're trying to work on, is trying to basically do a better job of predicting where storms may form. That I think you can do a little more on a seasonal timescale. And for example, if storms form right off the west coast of Africa, those storms can hit the Gulf of Mexico, but the odds of them making it into the Gulf are fairly low. They're more likely to either hit the East Coast or just basically recurve out into the ocean and not be particularly significant events, at least for the United States. And that's something we're kind of trying to work on. But unfortunately, so we do probabilities of United States landfall. So we basically will say, like, this year, the probabilities of landfall are elevated because we're forecasting an above normal season. So you can have a nasty landfalling hurricane in a quiet season, or you can have a really busy season with no landfalls. But in general, more active seasons do have more landfalling hurricanes.
That makes sense. Okay, so talking about active hurricanes and landfall, I know also when we spoke last time, and this was part of your presentation that I saw at Elevate, you were talking about the pressure within hurricanes, and if you're using that as a different measure for the kind of damage that it could cause. Can you talk a little bit about that and like the historical hurricanes based on like where their categorization could be different based on pressurization? I think you know where I'm going with that question.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, so when Michelle and I last talked, we talked about basically hurricanes are categorized by their maximum winds. And so the stronger the winds, the higher the category. And what's known as the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. So from a category 1 to a category 5, with category 5 being the strongest. And so that system's been in place for about almost 50 years now, and in general works reasonably well. But we were arguing that it's actually better to categorize hurricanes by pressure as opposed to wind. And the reason why that's the case is because if you know the wind, that's what you know. You know the strongest winds anywhere in the hurricane, but you have no idea, is it a small hurricane in size? Is it a huge hurricane? You really have that one number doesn't tell you that, whereas pressure will give you some idea about how large the storm is. And the reason that's the case is because hurricanes have wind because of a difference in pressure between the center of the storm, so in the eye, and kind of the environment outside of the hurricane. So if you have a hurricane that is small, you can say have a pressure that's relatively high, given the wind is related to the gradient or the difference in pressure between what's going on outside the hurricane and what's going on in the eye. So for a very large hurricane in size, you have to have a very, very low pressure to get strong winds, because that gradient or that difference in pressure is spread out over a large area. So for example, two storms I always like to talk about are Hurricane Charlie versus Katrina. Both really nasty hurricanes, caused a lot of damage, but Charlie's pressure was, when it made landfall, was about 940 millibars. Whereas Katrina's was 920 millibars. So Charlie had the stronger winds, but it was a very, very small system. And so it caused a lot of damage where it made landfall, but it didn't have much storm surge associated with it. So that wind-driven increase in water that you see when the storm comes on shore was fairly small. Whereas Katrina was a huge hurricane, much larger in size. So while the maximum winds may have been slightly lower than Charlie's, it had an enormous storm surge, 25 or more feet into parts of Louisiana and Mississippi. And so consequently, we argue that the damage potential from a storm like Katrina was much higher than Charlie. Not that Charlie wasn't a significant event, but Katrina was a much more significant event. And even had the levees in New Orleans held, and we hadn't seen the epic humanitarian the humanitarian failure and all the damage that was caused in New Orleans, over 200 people in Mississippi died just from the storm surge in Katrina. So, it's important to look at the wind, but we argue that the pressure is actually a better metric. And it's also much, much easier to measure. Trying to know where the strongest winds are in a hurricane you're flying an airplane in is really, really challenging. Whereas the pressure is much easier to measure, both with an airplane. You can fly a plane into the center of the hurricane and drop basically a sonde that measures the pressure. You can also on land, anemometers, which are devices that measure wind, chronically fail in high wind environments, whereas pressure, you can have it even inside your house and get an accurate measurement of the pressure.
Have you been on one of those planes that flies into the middle of a hurricane?
No, and I was actually on a presentation yesterday where they were asking about, what goes on and measure, how do they measure hurricane winds and pressures from aircraft? And I said, unfortunately, I've never been on one of those. I'm on a waiting list, but it's a very long list.
It's a very long wait list, like getting
That's right.
Elon Musk's ships to any outer space.
Exactly.
Yes, got to wait a while. Okay, I feel like you should be high up on the list though, based on what you do. But anyway, okay. So restoration contractors are always trying to stay up on what is happening in the tropics and what systems are coming in and see ahead, like, as far out as they can, like, okay, maybe I need to deploy here. So what are some of the best resources you might point our industry toward to stay on top of what's happening in the tropics?
Yeah, so for day-to-day weather stuff, the National Hurricane Center is a fantastic resource. So for example, there's a system right now that they're monitoring. So they do what they call tropical weather outlooks, and they do those 4 times a day. And let's see, that would be 8 a.m. and 8 a.m., 2 p.m., 8 p.m., and 2 a.m. Eastern time. Trying to translate from mountain time where I live. And so those are good if you're trying to kind of get a feel of what they're looking at for potential development. So that's a resource that I use all the time. And so right now they're monitoring something near the Yucatan Peninsula that may potentially impact Florida in a couple of days. I'm supposed to fly to Key Largo on Sunday, so we'll see how that, or I'm supposed to fly to Miami on Sunday. We'll see how that goes. Right. So we'll see how that goes, but that's a really good resource. If you're looking further out, there's a ton of websites that will display kind of model forecasts of what might be forming in the next 5 to 10 days, but models will often spin up storms that don't actually come to fruition, which is good. If every model storm came to fruition, we'd have you forecasting 40 hurricanes a year, which thankfully we don't have. But there are a variety of different websites you can use. One website that I really do like to use is what's called Tropical Tidbits. It's one of the most popular, I think, model visualization websites out there. But it's important to realize, again, just because a model spins up a storm does not guarantee that it will develop. Sure. And so when you look at model output, what I look at is, so they'll basically run a model at a really, really high resolution. So it'll be basically run on supercomputers, and it'll be run, say like 10 to 20 kilometer resolution around the entire globe, but really, really high resolution stuff. And that's great, but then that gives you one answer. It either forms or it doesn't. Then they'll run these models at slightly lower resolution, but they'll run like 50 iterations, and that'll give you an idea give you more of a probabilistic idea. So like, okay, 20% of the models said that the storm is going to form. So it'll give you a little better idea. But again, the National Hurricane Center is looking at this stuff. So they'll basically will translate all that model gobbledygook and, give their best insight as to what the percent chance is that a particular system will form in both the next 2 days and the next 5 days.
Okay. And your next reports come out on July 7th and August 4th. Is that right?
That is correct. So our next update comes out July 7th and our final one comes out the 4th of August. And we always try to emphasize that even though, the 4th of August is 2 months into the hurricane season, the Atlantic hurricane season, while it's 6 months long, is extremely peaked. Over 90% of your major hurricane activity occurs just between August through October. So that's really when things really ramp up. So one thing we always tell people is, June and July normally are fairly quiet. We may get a storm or two, maybe one hurricane, but it's not like what we see, especially in September, when, you can get 3 or 4 storms in the Atlantic simultaneously.
Okay, perfect. Okay, anything that we didn't cover that you think we should touch on?
I always try to emphasize with these seasonal forecasts, they're not perfect. We have had huge colossal busts in the past. Probably the most famous bust from when I've been involved was in 2013, where we forecast 9 hurricanes and got 2. So, the forecasts aren't perfect, but we can give you some ideas how busy the season's going to be. This is our 39th year, so we have a 38-year track record that shows reasonably good levels of skill. But we can't say exactly where the storms are going to go. So, obviously we always have stress people being prepared, especially now as the hurricane season ramps up. And then, I said, especially, if you're trying to, kind of know where you want to be, planning assets and things like that, I definitely recommend the tropical weather outlooks from the National Hurricane Center. And there's a variety of different model output, but once you get beyond about 5 days out, it's really, the models aren't always very good at being able to predict if storms are going to form. Once a storm forms, the models get pretty good at forecasting its track and potentially its intensity, but forecasting tropical cyclone genesis or formation of these storms is still a real challenging problem.
Okay. I love it. Yeah. I see on Facebook in our industry, a lot of people that'll start posting like images and it's like, this might be something. And it's like,
it's hard. I get excited about it too, but I think it was mid-May, there was one of the American model, the global forecast system had this, storm spinning up in the Caribbean, run after run after run, and it never happened. So that's people get excited, but you have to realize, especially 7, 10, 14 days out, there's just a lot that can change. And tropical cyclone forecasting, tropical cyclones the prediction of tropical cyclone formation is still a really challenging problem.
All right. Well, Phil, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the update. Thank you for all the work you and your team do. This is a big help, obviously, to our industry and people who live in the lines of fire. So thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you again, hopefully with the next update and seeing what's happening so far and what's changing.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Michelle. Take care.
Thank you.
For more Restoration Today, visit our website, cnrmagazine.com, or find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts.